Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. So, regular listeners will know that about a year ago I had Mike Slade on the pod, and we talked about Starwave and a bunch of early web stuff, but as you'll know if you listen to that episode, Mike was also a close confidant of Steve Jobs, and Steve asked him to come on for about 6 years, starting in the late 90s, as Steve's personal consigliere at Apple when Steve returned to Apple. And in that episode, we said that Mike needed to come back on the show and talk about all that stuff. And that's something that you guys have been strenuously requesting ever since that episode dropped. So, today, here it is. Now that I've done enough research to do this conversation justice, today is Mike Slade telling the story of Steve Jobs' return to Apple. Mike Slade, thanks for coming back on the Internet History Podcast.
My pleasure. It was fun last time.
So, right, we teased last time that you needed to come back and tell some of your Apple stories, so that's what we're going to do today. Let's just start with Steve asking you to join him back at Apple. Were you still at Starwave when Apple bought Next?
What happened was Apple bought Next in late '96, and I was still at Starwave running it, and I had stayed in close touch with Steve after I stopped working at Next, and we saw each other a bunch and talked on the phone a lot, and I visited him a couple times in Palo Alto for various business trips. And then in early '97, this deal closed where Disney bought part of Starwave, and we became kind of a we were sort of like Czechoslovakia. We were part of Disney, but we were still independent. And so I was the chairman and CEO of Starwave, and I spent about half my time working with people at Disney on stuff and half my time at Starwave. And so I took some time off, and then that fall I was on a big long vacation in Turkey, and Steve had by that time kind of become sort of he'd gotten rid of Emilio, and he called me up and wanted me to run corporate marketing for Apple. They already had Phil Schiller running product marketing, and he wanted me to be all kind of his branding guy. And I would have loved to do it, but I couldn't really leave. I kind of had a bunch of handcuffs, and I was sort of in charge of this crazy complicated joint venture between Starwave and Disney and ESPN and ABC News. So I couldn't really come, and so I stayed in touch with him, and then finally through most of 1998 we did all this complicated negotiating, and eventually I was free at the end of '98. This complicated deal happened where Disney bought out Paul and then flipped most of the company into InfoSeek, and we all became shareholders of InfoSeek, and we did well financially, and I was just a consultant at this point. So finally, in November of 1998, I was free, and I told Steve I was going to be free, and he wanted me to come work for him. And I said I couldn't really work there full time because I had little kids at home and stuff. And so we agreed that I would work there part time. So I joined his executive staff in November of 1998, and what I did most of the time was I'd come down to Apple typically 2 days a week, sometimes 1 day a week, but usually 2 days a week. And I'd come down on Monday morning, and I'd usually go to 5 or 6 meetings in the 2 days with him. So I'd go to his Monday morning executive staff meeting, which went from 9 to about 12:30 usually, and that was me, Steve, Fred Anderson, the CFO, Nancy Heinen, the head of legal, a guy named Mitch Mandich who ran sales, a guy named Tim Cook who ran sort of supply and logistics, John Rubenstein who ran hardware engineering, Avi Tavanian who ran software engineering, Phil Schiller who ran product marketing, me, and I think that was it.
And
I think that was it at the start.
Your role is basically just be consigliere and just like a sounding
board?
Yeah,
you know, it's hard to imagine how little people at a place like Apple got the internet in late 1998, but they were just sort of starting to figure it out. And so I was both a consigliere and kind of a guy who had no agenda, so I could give sort of an honest take on stuff without protecting any turf or anything. And Apple was a much different company then. There was no iPod, and there was barely an iMac, and there was no iBook yet, and a lot of their business was worrying about how many Power Macs and Power Books they were selling and just trying to get it going. And so I went to basically 5 or 6 meetings each week. So I'd go to the staff meeting, and then oftentimes Steve and I would have lunch together because my office was right next to his, and then we'd wander around campus. We'd usually go visit Johnny in the design lab, and then there was a meeting every Monday afternoon with Avi's group. It was Avi and all of his direct reports who were designing Mac OS X. Mac OS X didn't exist yet in late 1998. It was still they were still creating it, and it was a very complicated piece of engineering because they had to combine the old Mac operating system and the next operating system into this new thing that ran old code and had new apps. So there was a lot of work being done on the user interface for it and all the other stuff for it. And so there was a meeting every week behind closed doors with all of Avi's direct reports, who included Scott Forstall and a bunch of other guys who people know about, and I would help him do that. And then after that, I'd usually go collapse because I'd been up since 4:30 in the morning flying down. And then on Tuesday, there were usually a couple of meetings with this guy named Sina Tamadin. That's the other person who was a direct report, I forgot, who originally he ran service, and then they created an apps division, and he started the apps division. So Sina created iMovie, iTunes, iPhoto, iDVD, etc. And we would do that meeting on Tuesday morning, and then often I would work on some other special projects, and then usually the ad agency came up either Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon, and I'd meet with them too. So that was Steve and Lee Clow and a guy named James Vincent who worked for Slade Day, and me, and often Phil Schiller, and we'd just work on whatever we were working on for advertising. And then I'd usually fly home after that.
Well,
that was my week.
Before we get into all the stories like the iPod and the iMac and all that stuff, just to back up a second, because you knew him, in your opinion, did Steve always yearn to go back to Apple? Because he plays it coy, of course, at the time, but do you feel like he always wanted to go back?
Yes, always. He always talked about when I worked at Next. Always, always, always. So from the I worked at Next from early 91 until late 92, and he was always talking about Apple. Now, it's worth noting that Next's hardware strategy was intricately involved with Apple's hardware strategy. So Next's strategy was to use the same CPU that Apple used and leverage the Motorola relationship. And then they were always a step ahead of Apple because they were smaller. So each time a new rev of the 6830 or 40 came out, and then this new RISC chip they were building, the 88110, was going to come out, Apple was slow and Next was fast, and Next would beat them to it at whatever rev it was. So they were kind of intricate, and they had some people who had worked at Apple and things like that. But yeah, he always thought that the people running Apple weren't doing a very good job, and he yearned for it, even though, Next's business was more kind of corporate focused and consumer focused in those days. We were selling to big corporations and the CIA and people like that, and less to consumers. So he was always sort of torn by the fact that he had to worry about these corporate customers, even though his instincts were consumer. And, I always thought he was put on this earth to sell things to consumers, not to corporations, always. It's good that it worked out.
When he does come back and you're sitting in on these meetings with him, I read, early on, I read a scene where, when he first gets there, Steve calls a big meeting with all the upper level management types, and he basically says to them, all right, go around the table, tell me who you are and what you can do for me. So was the main part of the strategy at the very beginning just finding who the superstars are, who the bozos are, and then arranging the talent and getting Apple back in shape?
Yeah, I visited a couple times in 97 or 98, I kind of forget which, before I came back to work there. And I remember meeting some people, like there was a guy who was there for a while who left in charge of marketing named Garena DeLuca, who Steve couldn't really make up his mind about. And so he went through a period of time where he was working with the old crew at Apple. But by the time I actually started working there, most of those people I named on the exec team were either new or had worked at Next. So Avi and Rubenstein and Nancy Heinen and Sina Tamadin had all been Next executives. And so I knew them, Steve knew them, and we all kind of like could finish each other's sentences. Tim Cook was new to Apple and was 10 times better at what he did than the people who had been in charge of it. Like, it was criminal how much better he was. They had done it so poorly. The sales guy had also come from Next, Mitch Mandich. And so everybody kind of knew each other. And the only holdover from Apple was Fred Anderson. And then Phil Schiller had worked at the old Apple and then left and he'd been at Macromedia for a while. And then there'd been this spin-off from Next called Firepower Systems that John Rubinstein ran, that Canon owned. And Phil was the head of product marketing for that. So everybody kind of knew each other. And so Phil was a huge Apple lover. So anyway, yes, to answer your question, Steve said to me one time, look, and I'm sure he had said this to other people, my goal is half the people here are good and half are bozos. I've got to keep the good ones from leaving and get rid of the bozos as soon as possible. So I think every time he met with somebody, he was trying to figure out which bin to put them in, the bozo bin or the good, worth keeping bin, right? And there were great people at Apple still, but many had left. And by then you had the first .com boom going on, so you had all these crazy valuations of stupid startups and stuff that, you know, people were tempted by.
Well, if it's a process of finding the diamonds in the rough and also bringing in the people he likes from Next, but obviously one of the bigger diamonds in the rough is Johnny. And were you around when Steve discovers that?
No, by the time I got there, Steve had already figured out that he loved Johnny, and so I think I had heard from him anecdotally, but I wasn't around for those moments when he first met him. There was this computer they had. This was the funny story that they showed me, and I think it might be in one of the books. So the computer that Johnny designed before the iMac was this educational computer that was sort of a holdover from the last vestiges of Apple before Steve took over. That was a thing that internally was very similar to an iMac, but looked like an iMac with boils and the plague. Like, it was this giant bulbous thing with every port known to man, parallel, serial, USB 1.0, ADB keyboard, like the most complicated thing you've ever seen, and removable this, and every checklist item. And it was huge and ugly, but it had some design elements in it, mostly around dots and texture that were the sort of the precursor of the iMac, and was the thing that Steve liked. Now, the story. You probably heard the story of the iMac, which is that it was supposed to be a network computer, the world's most horrible idea.
Right.
And they had designed it as such, and Steve was like, "This is stupid. Nobody's going to buy one of these things. The internet's too slow. They need a hard disk." And Fred Anderson famously said, the non-technical CFO said, "Why don't we just cram a hard disk in there and boot System 7 on it?" And they all said, "We can't do that. We can't cool it." And Steve said, "Sure we can," like that. He was like, "Sure." They had this impossible task that they managed to do. And that's why if you look at the first iMac, which is sort of a see-through computer, it's kind of ugly inside because it was kind of a hack job, right? But a really good idea.
Well, they sort of sold that as, look, you can see the guts. How cool is that?
Well, that's just because Johnny had clever ideas and, Bondi Blue and everything. So by the time I got there, they had already shipped that thing, and they were trying to do the next round of them, and there was an amazing amount of time spent on what colors we should do. We did 5 colors. We licensed this song from an old Rolling Stones album called Colors, that has a piano intro, and it's do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
Right.
And which is one of my favorite songs of all time. And there was a lot of debate about which colors to do, and then how hard was it logistically to do the colors. And then what was really interesting was they shipped, and it wasn't at all even. 1 or 2 colors just dominated. Almost nobody bought the yellow one or whatever it was. It was kind of comical. It was almost pointless to have the colors, but it seemed cool.
Stepping backwards again into saving the company, because obviously the iMac,
right?
The iMac is sort of one of the things that helps save it. But strategic thinking, I read an interview with Heidi Roizen where she said that when Steve came back, he didn't necessarily have a plan. But then also there's that famous, 4-quadrant chart. We're going to simplify down everything to, 1 entry-level computer, 1 pro computer, 1 entry-level laptop, 1 pro laptop. So from your recollection...
the 2x2 grid.
Right, exactly. Yeah. From your recollection, was there a particular strategy that he came in with, or was it just sort of...
Yes. he basically decided that they were trying to do, they were almost broke, right? And so there were two parts of the strategy on sort of the supply side. One part was make and sell lots of high margin computers, mostly towers, but also expensive laptops, right? And two, simplify the product line drastically, and you'll be able to get rid of people and make it successful. So they went from 17 hardware product lines to 4. And he would always talk about that, and that was where the 2x2 grid came from, where one dimension was pro or versus consumer, and the other was desktop versus laptop. And you have to remember, in those days, desktops outsold laptops, and so it was kind of novel to focus so much on laptops. So they did the iMac. It was a very low-margin computer. They're making a lot of money on towers with G3s and G4s in them, and on the titanium PowerBook, which was a big hit. And then they introduced the iBook, which was sort of this. If you look at a picture of an iBook, it's really ugly and stupid, but it was novel, so it sold fairly well. Not the original white MacBook, but the original iBook was this curvy thing that looked like kind of a pancake version of an iMac, and it really is sort of stupid looking, but it sold pretty well. And then he did the Cube, which was a huge mistake. And the Cube, most people don't know about this. The idea behind the Cube was to have the little box, the Cube, and then have this new high-speed bus for all the peripherals, which today is a really good idea, but was ahead of its time in 2000. And they never finished the bus, so they just shipped the thing without any external connectivity, right, without any slots. And then it ended up being kind of expensive, and nobody bought it, but it was pretty.
Oregon State University is proud to be a sponsor of the Techmeme Ride Home. Ranked as the number 3 best university in the country for solving climate change, Oregon State makes seeking solutions a priority, going the farthest lengths to help the earth and all living creatures thrive. Their creative minds, research knowledge, and drive inspire them to generate ideas no one else has. Oregon State will never stop doing the hard work. They will continue exploring, creating, and taking action on the issues that matter most to their students and community, and build a better world for future generations. With nearly 200 degree programs, Oregon State has a path to the career and future you always wanted. They've been ranked number 2 in the world for the study of forestry and number 3 in the world for the study of oceanography. And Oregon State's top-ranked eCampus offers 40-plus online degree programs, maximum flexibility, and innovative courses taught by OSU faculty. Discover more at oregonstate.edu. That's oregonstate.edu. Let's say you've been stewing about a health problem you've been having, and so you almost resort to texting your group chat to get your friends' opinions. Well, you're extremely unlikely to find quality medical advice in your group chat, but you can find it from a doctor on ZocDoc. Thousands of medical professionals on ZocDoc stand ready to help you. They listen like a friend and give you the expert care you need. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. No more doctor roulette or scouring the internet for questionable reviews. With ZocDoc, you have a trusted guide to connect you to your favorite doctor you haven't met yet. Millions of people use ZocDoc's free app to find and book a doctor in their neighborhood who is patient-reviewed and fits their needs and schedule just right. Go to ZocDoc.com/Techmeme and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/Techmeme. ZocDoc.com/Techmeme. So you mentioned that you were sitting in on some of the marketing campaigns as well.
All of them.
Right. So tell me just the evolution of the Think Different campaign, because that also was key to turning around Apple's fortunes in terms of getting people to realize, hey, we're back to doing our best stuff.
Okay, so this is kind of funny. So I was still working at Starwave in, I believe it's early '98. The Think Different campaign runs in '98, and what happens is I get a phone call from Steve, and he says, hey, I need your help. And I wasn't working there. I was still running Starwave. And he goes, I need your help. I'm working on this ad campaign, and we're having an argument about something, and I need your help. And I go, sure. So he goes, this guy you don't know named Lee Clow is going to call you, and I want you to look at something and tell me what you think. I go, okay. So Lee Clow calls me, and he's kind of, we now are really good friends, but he was kind of pissed off. He knew who I was, but he didn't know me. And he was like, okay, Steve wants me to do this, blah, blah, blah. And so they had the Think Different commercial, here's to the crazy ones. They had it done, and they were arguing about who should narrate it. So he goes, I'm going to send you both versions. And in 1998, to send me both versions meant they had to do a satellite uplink and then burn to a VHS or a DVD. I can't remember which. I think it was a VHS. The clip. And so they did this thing to the Seattle office. They messengered it over to my office in Bellevue. The whole thing probably cost $1,000 just to do, right? And so anyway, this VHS shows up, and I stick it in my TV in my office, and I watch both versions of Think Different. The first version is Steve narrating it, and the second version is Richard Dreyfuss narrating it. And the agency wanted Steve to narrate it. They thought it would be cool, kind of like Lee Iacocca. Remember, I built the K car, Chrysler spec. And Steve didn't really want to do it. And he didn't want to do it mostly because he didn't like to exploit his fame, which is not what most people think, but he really didn't. And he was self-conscious in the fact that Apple hadn't really made it back yet. So it'd be kind of like pumping your chest. It'd be like some, washed-up rocker pimping his new group or something, right? So anyway, and they really wanted him to do it for all the obvious reasons. And I listened to it, and they kind of said, it's up to you. Like he did that thing where he wanted to let somebody else decide so he wouldn't take the heat, kind of, So they sort of, maybe he just did this to be cute, but it was positioned to me like, you're going to decide it, Mike. And I'm like, okay. So anyway, I liked the Richard Dreyfuss version way better just because I like his voice better. Steve's voice could be a little squeaky at the high end, right? He'd get kind of like that, he'd be all excited. And Richard Dreyfuss has a wonderful voice. He's one of my favorite actors. And I was like, forget about all this other stuff, Lee. It's just a better commercial, right? It's still a good commercial. You have zero chance of someone being distracted by the fact of, is it Steve or not, which is not the reason you're doing the commercial. You're doing the commercial because it's a great commercial. So just do it. And so they did do Richard Dreyfuss. I don't know how much credit to take for it, but that's what happened. And it was pretty funny. So by the time I got there, they all knew me from this incident, right? Like, oh, you're that guy, right? So we would sit in all these meetings and, and go over all the ad campaigns, some of which were pretty mundane. And, one of the things people forget is that before Think Different, or maybe about the same time, right after Think Different, they did this ad campaign for the towers where they made fun of Intel. Where they had this thing with Tank. It was really a cornball, techie speeds and feeds ad about how Motorola chips were faster than Intel chips, and it was all just so they could sell those high margin towers because they made a couple $1,000 a tower on those, and that way, when Steve came back to Apple, they had almost no cash, and a couple years later, they had $4 billion in cash. And so.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that was all from selling those high-end towers. That's all it was.
So, right, when they suddenly have profitability again, like that first time he walks off the stage, oh, by the way, we're profitable.
It wasn't just that. It was that they were high margin, right?
Yeah,
and so Apple was emphasizing all these weird product lines, and he was like, we just got to sell some high margin towers. They would always sell 300,000 or 400,000 towers a year, and, you can do the math, a couple $1,000 of gross margin a tower, that's a lot of money, right? And so that's how they built the balance sheet back up in a couple of years, and also some much smarter management of inventory and supplies and stuff. And so by the time all those strategic things were happening, like, music, iPod, everything, iPhone, everything, they already had $4 billion of cash in the bank. And so you could have lost $100 million a quarter for 40 quarters, right? So there was no doubt of its survival anymore. One of the funny things is that people always think that the Microsoft investment was the key to their survival. It was only $150 million. They made more than that in any quarter just in cash flow from selling towers. So it was kind of a symbolic thing when they did that investment. And then, of course, the irony was Microsoft CFO Greg Maffei hedged it, so they didn't make any money on it. Oops. Yeah. But anyway, so the key was those towers in terms of getting the company stabilized.
before we move on from marketing, were you around for the Mac versus PC guy, or was that after your time?
Well, what happened is that we did a lot of product-oriented advertising from '98 to like '03, and we did a lot of some other like tactical stuff. We did a couple of music ads and stuff, but a lot of it, and the original couple of iPod ads, which were very, people forget how sort of straightforward the first iPod ad. It was a picture of a video of a guy in an apartment listening to his music on his laptop and then plugging in his iPod and leaving with the same music in it. And the tagline was just 1,000 songs in your pocket. There were no dancing girls or anything. But this guy, James Vincent, was kind of the account exec. Normally an ad agency has a bunch of guys in suits, and then the creative guys get to come and go, and the suits do most of the talking to the CEO or the guy in charge. And Steve didn't want that, so he was sort of the VP of marketing. And he just had Lee Cloud, the chief creative officer for all of the conglomerate, and his team come up each week. And then this one guy, the only non-creative or media person that got to come to the meeting was this guy, James Vincent, who's a really smart British guy who was kind of younger and hipper and didn't really act like an account exec, even though he was nominally an account exec. So we would have these brainstorming meetings, and he and I, James Vincent and I, were the two guys who were pushing Steve to compare Mac to Windows. This never really was relevant until Vista. Once Vista came and was such a disaster, and by this time Mac OS X had A, shipped, and B, by its second rev was kind of useful, and apps are being ported to it. So it wasn't embarrassing to talk about our platform, because Mac OS IX it would crash all the time, and it was old school technology, and it, honestly wasn't as safe or as stable as Windows, right? But Mac OS X was. So once we got to that point, we were like, we should really play up this notion that people are switching and they like it. And you may remember before Mac versus PC, there was an ad campaign called Switchers, where they hired a guy, I was around for this, they hired a guy, a famous documentary filmmaker, and he did all these interviews with people who had switched from PC to Mac. And they talked, his name was Errol Morris. He's
Errol
a very
Morris,
famous Yeah. And so those ads, James and I kind of cooked up the whole process for them, and they did this series of interviews with people, and those are kind of the precursor of Mac versus PC, because they were very vivid ads, right? And then they kind of realized that why do it with people? Why don't you just hire actors? They're better, right? And so Mac versus PC was sort of the son of that campaign in a way, if you think about it. It was the same message, right?
Yeah.
Directly compare, right? Blah, blah, blah. So I don't remember. I think Mac versus PC is after I left.
Yeah.
But that was kind of James's baby.
All right, so to jump back in time again, because we're going to try to get into the iPod here. This is a story that I read, so you can either fill in the gaps for me or you can correct me if it's wrong. But at CES in 2000, Bill Gates gives a keynote, and he outlines like computers becoming home media centers.
The digital hub story.
And
that's right.
And so after this, there's an offsite executive staff meeting or something, and you basically
there was an offsite at the Palo Alto Garden Court Hotel. That's right. I was at it.
And so you pitched this to Steve as
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
I basically So this is a true story. So what happened is Bill gives the keynote at CES. I think it's 2001. I don't know. We could look it up. Whatever year it is. It's either 2000 or 2001. And he says the digital hub, blah, 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 blah. And, Microsoft has been doing this forever. And it was a really good pitch, except they didn't really have any of it, right? And so we were in this offsite, and I basically regurgitated the pitch, right, using my unique talent of irony. And everybody instantly realized the point, which was that since Apple was always the creator's computer, right, they should be the one that was the digital hub, not Microsoft, right? And it'd be easy for us to do because we already had iMovie, and, it was sort of a layup to do all these apps and connect things to a Mac, blah. This was before the iPod. And so it was the idea came from, I won't take credit for the idea of doing the digital hub. I'll take credit for the idea of laying the spark because one of my jobs at Apple was to be the Microsoft kind of guru, right? So I would always sort of like know what was going on for my friends, because in those days I still had a lot of friends that worked at Microsoft, and I'd know what they were doing and what was going right and what was going wrong. And I would, like, for example, it took me like 2 years to get Apple to have good good support for Exchange servers in their mail client. Because I was like, guys, there are like 200 million people using Exchange worldwide. Everyone in business uses it, right? So like, you should support it. And none of them had ever used it, right? So they didn't understand, right? So things like that. So yeah, I regurgitated the digital hub strategy and then pointed out that they were a long way from fulfilling it and how lame their stuff was, and everybody got really excited. And so that's where the apps division kind of started from, is that Sina. So what had happened was Sina Tamadin had supervised the buy. They were working on this product called Final Cut Pro. They bought from Macromedia to compete with Adobe. And there was a brilliant guy working on it named Glenn Reed who built a consumerized version of it called iMovie. So the iMovie project was a really radical project, as you can imagine, right? Because in 1998, who would make a movie on a computer, right? Mm-hmm. So they basically took this super complicated video editing program, got it down to like 5 menu items and 4 screens, and shipped it on every iMac. And what's funny is that to make a movie then meant that you had to have a digital tape camera. There were 2 types of video cameras. Right. There were ones that were regular. There was a new kind called digital, but they still had little tape cassettes.
Cassettes, right.
And it had a FireWire port on it. Sony made them, and other people made them. And so since every iMac had a FireWire port on it, you could hook up the camera to it. So what you do is you would make the movie. You would make a bunch of footage with your video camera, and then instead of just looking at it, you could import it in real time, like second by second. Edit like crazy and add titles and credits and music and all this great stuff. And then you had this beautiful movie, and the only problem was, 3 of them filled up your whole hard disk. Mm-hmm. And what did you do with the movie? So what you had to do was, there were no DVD burners yet. You had to spool it back out to the tape, mm-hmm. second by second, through this FireWire interface. And Steve gave the whole executive team a Sony digital video camera, an iMac, and a copy of iMovie before he shipped it, and gave us an assignment for on a Monday. He said, by next Monday, you will come back with a movie. We're going to watch everybody's movie. Mm-hmm. So we all made movies and came back, and the next week for the whole staff meeting, we just watched the movies. So we were the testers for it, the executive team.
Well, and as you're pointing out, though, that's super complicated. and so I almost have the sense...
It was way ahead of its time. And it turned out to be a flawed strategy because it caused them to miss the initial run of Napster and CD burning.
Okay, that's exactly what I was going to say. I almost had the sense that the reason that iTunes sort of comes next is because in that Napster era, what is easy is everybody's playing around with these MP3 files on their hard drives.
Because they're much smaller files mm-hmm. than video files. So, so what happens is Steve gets all excited about iMovie because, he has little kids, and we all do, and we're making these. The movies we made were mostly about how adorable our kids were, right? And then the people who didn't have kids made really funny movies, like Fred Anderson, whose kids were older and away from the home. He made a movie about his cat, and I'm like, I'm glad I'm not you. And then I remember Tim Cook made a movie about trying to buy a house in Palo Alto and how expensive it was. And John Rubinstein, who was single then, made the funniest movie. He had to go to IBM for some damn chip meeting in Dallas, and so he made a movie about how he spent his birthday in this boring hotel room in Dallas. So he gets up with the camera, shoots himself in the mirror, and says, "Happy birthday, John." And then he goes to this meeting at IBM, turns the camera on, and says, "Wish me a happy birthday, everybody." And they're all like, "Turn that camera off. What are you doing?" Like that. That was the best movie of all, was that one, because it was so ironically funny. But anyway, so then, what happens is, meanwhile, young kids with PCs with stickers on them are ripping files off and burning them like crazy, and there's real jukebox, and there's Music Match, and all these super complicated things. And so Steve ships this thing called an iMac DV, which is a DVD player in it, and has FireWire and iMovie, and does this kludgy thing for making movies. And then we realized that it's really hard to make movies, and people don't do it very often. And so they panic. The next version of the iMac has a CD read-write drive in it, which is a tray load, not a slot load, which is ugly but cheaper and easier. And so then he buys iTunes, which was this guy, Jeff Robbins, who had worked at Apple and had left and had this little startup. He buys his Mac jukebox program. What?
Was it Sound Jam?
Right?
Yeah.
Sound Jam, which was a perfectly nice program and really ugly. And they turned it into iTunes, which I was there for, which was super cool. and we're in a meeting. So they started this apps division because of this offset that you mentioned. So after iMovie, the next one is iTunes. And so we come in to design iTunes with this code base, and Jeff is there, and Sina's there, and a bunch of designers there, and Steve's there, and I'm there, and Phil Schiller's there, or whoever's there. And we walk in, and, and all these jukebox programs were like nuclear submarines. They're really complicated, lots of dialog boxes, tons of sliders. People were kind of competing on how many features they had, right? So it was so geeky. So Steve walks in and he goes, one screen, no dialog boxes. That's all he says. He goes, one screen, no dialog boxes. And people were like, what? And that's how we designed iTunes, with that list of criteria. One screen, no dialog boxes. And so what they would do, it was so interesting having worked at Microsoft where people had these long specs that they wrote, and a priest would toil in the corner writing this sacred spec, and then you shall implement the spec according to the spec, and thou dost not protest or deviate from the spec. The spec was what Steve liked, and so they'd do these really expensive color printouts of screens, and he'd pick the ones he liked and didn't like, and then we just kind of implement it. And there, how in the original iTunes, it still has it today, there's a series of sliders up on top. It says like genre, artist, song, album, right?
Right.
Well, that's called the list view, and it was invented in NextStep. No computers had that until NextStep. And I argued vociferously to put it in iTunes. And Steve didn't want to have it. He just wanted to have a scrolling list of songs that you could click on the columns to sort them. And I was like, that'll be too long. And he goes, no, people will just search. And I was like, no, people would love to go click, click, click. And I couldn't get him to do it. He thought it was ugly, and it would muck up his beautiful one-screen, simple user interface, which he had the right idea, which is to keep it radically simple. But this was really a powerful feature and easy to use. And so I finally one day just threw a tantrum. I was like a real shithead. I just threw this tantrum. I insulted him. I yelled. I was moaned. I got cynical, and I got it in.
Well, sometimes people say that he responded to if you kind of fought back on him.
That's what happened. So anyway, but then they did this thing where they totally pivoted. There's a great commercial they did where there's a bunch of people in a concert hall. They have all these famous musicians to sort of simulate what it's like to put together a playlist. And they had this ad campaign called Rip, Mix, Burn.
I remember it well.
Do you remember this ad campaign?
Yeah.
And everybody got mad about it. And the reason they got mad about it, including Michael Eisner, is that people thought RIP meant rip off. Mm-hmm. What RIP really means is raster image process, and it means digitize an analog source, right? Mm-hmm. That's what it means. So RIP does not mean rip off.
Right.
So nobody got that in Hollywood because they're a bunch of morons.
Well, they were in the midst of the Napster panic freakout.
I know. And so anyway, you're like, no, you moron. It means take the CD you already bought and put the music on your hard disk. So anyway, they did that, and then the iPod came after that.
Well, all right.
At the same time, we were working on iPhoto. Those two things sort of came around the same time.
I got lucky. I stumbled into the career that I love, but accidentally. I wanted to be a film director, and instead I became a startup founder. If you're a software engineer and you're looking to make an impact, maybe you should do what I did and consider looking beyond the obvious path. Bloomberg is building the world's most trusted information network for financial professionals, and they're looking for engineers to join them. I've never worked at Bloomberg personally, but there's no business or financial news source I trust more for the show. But also, think about it. At its core, Bloomberg is one of the world's preeminent data and technology companies already. At Bloomberg, you'll devise solutions and systems that solve complex real-world problems for customers across global capital markets. You'll be part of a team that builds and delivers tools to help the world's leading businesses and finance decision makers surface relevant information in an ever-expanding ocean of data and act on it quickly. The majority of Bloomberg software is built on C++, JavaScript, TypeScript, and Python, and Bloomberg engineers are active members of the open source community, both contributing to and leveraging open source software in their products. Working at Bloomberg means operating at insane scale. The company's real-time market data feeds ingest and process more than 30 billion, yes with a B, market data messages daily. Learn more about the opportunities that await you by visiting Bloomberg.com/careers. That's Bloomberg.com/careers. I've told you about Miro, the visual collaboration tool. Think of Miro as your team's visual platform to connect, collaborate, and create together, even if you're not actually together. That's what I want to focus on today. The shift to distributed work has broken many old and existing processes. Miro, though, gives your entire organization a way to replicate in-person meetings no matter where you're working, and rituals to drive the business forward. View and share the big picture overview with the whole team in a cinch. Strategic planning becomes easier when it's visual and accessible. Tap into a way to map processes, systems, and plans with the whole team so that not only can they view it, but they have a chance to give feedback. When everyone has a voice and everyone can tap into a single source of truth, your team remains engaged, invested, and happy. Watch silos crumble across departments with a whole host of tools and features designed to foster inclusive, democratic collaboration. Empower your entire team to take ideas from better to best with Miro. Sign up today at Miro.com/podcast, and if you use that link, your first 3 Miro boards are free forever when you sign up. That's Miro, MIRO.com/podcast.
Well, let's not yada over that. Let's. Do you remember first hearing of the iPod project? Because people that weren't there, they find it a little funny that iTunes came before iPod, but it seems logical. Like after you've organized your songs,
people were burning CDs. Yes,
right.
Of course. Well, so what happened was that Steve, once he realized that the iMovie strategy was flawed, he got really into music. And so I remember there was a meeting with Mark Levinson. Mark Levinson is famous as an audio designer, and he used to be married to the woman on Sex and the City. What's her name?
Kim Cattrall?
Yes. He used to be married to Kim Cattrall.
Yeah.
So he was kind of like a show horse. So he came to Apple one time with this company he had a company called Mark Levinson Audio, and he lost control of it. And he had a new company that had a different name, even though his name was Mark Levinson, and he wanted Steve to buy it. And so there was this discussion about buying it and getting into high-end audio and making speakers and everything. And instead, Steve was like, we got to do something in music. Music's the key, blah, 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 blah. And so cause he was always looking for the next great thing. Being at 3% market share wasn't really enough for him, right? Even though the Mac at this point was stable, but it was never going to get to 50% market share. Windows was too entrenched. So they decided not to do that. And then out of that, what had happened, the thing that people don't really realize is that 3 things were already happening that got you sort of halfway to the iPod. The first was every Mac shipped with a FireWire port in it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Fred Anderson would yell in the staff meeting that it was $50 a unit and it was killing our gross margin on the iMac because no one used it. So the FireWire port was this thing that Apple and Sony co-invented that was about the same speed as USB 2.0, only there wasn't USB 2.0 in those days. All there was USB 1.0, which was really slow. So it was really fast, and when you plugged something into it, it charged the device at the same time, which today seems like no big deal, but was magic then, right? Mm-hmm. So other than Apple, the only places where you saw FireWire were on most Sonys, although they used a different implementation that didn't have power, and on a few high-end PCs that had a card installed in them. So because every Mac had FireWire, starting with the towers and then the laptops and the iMac, there was this whole class of devices people used around Apple that were 20 and 40 and 5 and 10 and 20 and 40 gigabyte hard disks that plugged into the FireWire ports. They didn't have a power cord. So they were about twice the size of an iPod, right?
I had one,
and yeah, you remember this, right? And people would have their music libraries on them. I used to get an entire music library from somebody. He'd just hand it to me, right?
Right.
And you could boot a Mac off of it. So you could, if you had different code, you were going to show it to someone, you could boot off of that disk and everything. So it's kind of like having a computer in your pocket, right? Because it didn't have a power cord. You could just plug it into the Mac, and it automatically booted up and was powered on and had a high-speed transfer rate. So lots of people would say to themselves, God, if only this thing had a user interface, right? Because there already were Discmen, where people had these things where they could burn, instead of burning a 17-song CD, they could burn a digital CD with a couple hundred songs on it arranged in folders, right? So you could do that, and you still see cars that have that user interface for what folder, what catalog, right? So you could have a couple hundred songs on a disc, or you could have a really low capacity digital music player that a bunch of people, Creative Labs, Nike, all these people made, and they all had little tiny amounts of flash memory in them. So maybe they held 20 or 40 songs, right? You remember all this, right? And they were all USB 1.0. They weren't powered, and they were slow to load, but they were kind of cool. So there was already a company, Creative Labs, making a hard disk-based player. It was about the size of a discus. It had a 5 gigabyte hard disk in it.
Okay, guess what? I had that also.
Okay, you had it. So, and although it wasn't that bad it wasn't that heavy, but it had two big problems. One was the software was just horrible. I don't know if it was Music Match or worse. And the second thing was it had USB 1.0, which meant it took like all day to load, right? Like literally all day, like 10 hours.
You just loaded it once and then never tried to load it again.
But it just, so the combination of knowing about FireWire and knowing about these disks meant that the notion of what an iPod could be wasn't all that novel. I'm not trying to minimize the uniqueness of it. I'm just trying to say that the idea of doing it didn't seem crazy. It seemed like a logical next step. So then what happened is, and this has been written about, Rubinstein would always go to China and Japan and see all the vendors. And usually it was like, I have a new hard disk, it's bigger, it has more capacity, and it's faster, and blah, blah, blah. So instead, Toshiba said, typical strange Japanese company, we have a hard disk that isn't bigger and isn't faster, but it's smaller. And normally you'd say, like, well, who cares, right? They all fit in laptops anyway. But this was the hard disk that ended up in the original iPod. So it was radically smaller, and it wasn't as fast, but it didn't really matter. It was a 5 gig hard disk. And so that's where the idea came from, was from what can we do with this disk given what's already going on in the industry, right? So if you think about the first iPod from the standpoint of it required a Mac, it wasn't a Mac and PC product, right?
Right.
It totally changes what you could do and where your mindset would kind of come from, if you know what I mean. Because you'd like, oh yeah, well, I already know about FireWire, so it doesn't need power, and I can assume it connects quickly, and I already have iTunes, right? So off we go. So that's where it came from. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time with the teams. I knew it was coming. Steve told me about it. And I remember when Phil brought in, so Phil was always kind of a gadget freak. And Phil brought in a Bang & Olufsen remote because he was one of those guys. Mm-hmm. We all remember those kinds of people who had Bang & Olufsen gear, right? Mm-hmm. You kind of roll your eyes at them like, geez, really? So he had all sorts of B&O gear. And the B&O remote looked an awful lot like the scroll wheel in the iPod. Like exactly like it. And guess who never patented it? B&O.
Right.
So that's where it came from, is that Phil loved those remotes, and they had a little scroll wheel, a mechanical scroll wheel, like to navigate channels or whatever, right? Or volume or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, you can all read about Tony Fadell and the team and licensing the strange operating system and everything. But, that's where it came from. And then probably the most interesting thing I was involved in was what to call the damn thing, right? Because they couldn't make up their mind what to call it. Should it be called Tune Man or iTune this or, everything. And Steve was kind of adamant about it not being labeled as a music player, because he thought it was kind of a crappy category. So he agitated for the word not to be Tune or Tune Man or Walkman or whatever. The agency came up with Pod, not Steve. Slade came up with it from a long list. And in retrospect, the I part was kind of obvious because it was iMac and iBook and et cetera, et cetera. So, but the Pod was really brilliant.
Well,
and that's that.
It's that analogy of the hub. It's a pod off of the mothership, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's right. So, and then the first ad I always tell people is my favorite Apple ad ever, because it's such a make love to the product, cram a lot into an ad, Apple didn't do a we have a better iPod ad. They did it. This is a brand new category you never heard of ad, right?
Right.
That first ad to me is brilliant on so many levels, right? Because it shows the software, it shows how to use it, but the benefit is the guy walks off with 1,000 songs in his pocket, and you're like, holy shit. So I used to I used to fly, I flew every week on Alaska Airlines from Seattle to San Jose and back, sometimes twice a week. And I was always in first class. Thank you, Steve. And I was always talking to stewardesses, and they knew me because I did it so often. And I had this, all of a sudden, I had this iPod. And they were like, they thought it was like, it wasn't that they thought it was cool. No one understood what it was. But they're like, what is that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you mean? You'd show it to them, and you'd turn the wheel, and they'd go, huh? And you'd show them all 1,000 songs. And I loaded the thing up, and people just looked at you like you were a magician. Like, there's no way this is possible.
Two more things, and then I'll let you go that I want you to hear your perspective on around this story, around the iPod and iTunes. The first being, famously, Jobs didn't want to open up iTunes to PC users. He said it was him against everyone else. Do you remember any of those arguments about, listen, Steve, we got to take this to everybody?
Sure. The thing you have to realize is that all people cared about was selling more iMacs, right? The iMac wasn't selling that well.
So is that literally the argument that Steve is like, no, we can use this to sell more Macs, or what?
Well, the original idea was that this will sell more Macs and it'll be a virtuous circle, right? And then, and we sold a fair amount even the first quarter, right? And so then what happened was that people. Not so much me, although I was in the camp as well, but other people like Greg Joswiak and Steph and other people were agitating that it would be easy to sell it in the PC. And you got to remember, it took 2 years before iTunes got ported to the PC.
Right.
The iPod shipped in October of 2001, a month after September 11th, and the version with the store and iTunes on Windows wasn't until late 2003. So in between, they had this horrible hack solution, which is why Steve didn't like it, which was that they got Music Match to come in and pitch them. I got my buddies at Real Networks to come in and pitch them. They picked Music Match partly because Steve had this thing in the license agreement that said that whoever the party was that did the deal couldn't ever use the word syncing. He wanted to have rights in perpetuity to syncing things. Like, I was such a naked power grab, and Real Networks said, we're not doing this deal. And Music Match was like, sure, we'll do anything, right? So they did music, but so it was a horrible solution. They had this crappy software called Music Match, and you had to have a PC with a FireWire card on it or a Sony PC, right? Which almost nobody had.
Well, I did because, again, I guess I'm
just saying, but you're a geek, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying, it was not mainstream at all.
I had a
right?
Sony laptop that had the FireWire, yep. Mm-hmm.
Right. And Sony sold lots of laptops. But anyway, so I think Steve didn't like it for two reasons. One was he thought it would sell Macs, which wasn't really true. He didn't realize it could be such a big thing on its own. And two, he thought it would be yucky, which it was. Right. At that part, he was right about. It was really yucky, right? And it was the PC solution was vulnerable to somebody doing it better, whereas the Mac solution wasn't, right? Well, Steve never liked those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to do something unless it was great. But then, he changed his mind. It wasn't that many months after shipment that they did the thing, so he came around pretty quickly, partly because it was selling well, right?
Yeah.
Once it was selling well, he was like, oh, my God, I can sell this to PC users. This is great. Finally I have, an opening to Windows, right?
The other thing, and because we've already kind of glanced on it, is doing the store. Again, people are like, wait, iTunes was around before you could actually buy songs on it. Were you privy to any of those negotiations, like with the record companies?
Oh yeah, that took a long time. Steve wanted to do that from the moment the iPod shipped, and I was in some meetings with the record labels and stuff in 2001 and 2002 where they were like they did these two brain dead joint ventures, Music Match and what was the other one? One was Music Match was like, sorry, not Music Match, what was it called? Music Net, and it was Universal and maybe Warner and Real Networks, and then the other one was Sony. And anyway,
right. The point was that they weren't all on board one platform.
No, they each 60% were on one. It was just stupid, and they had all these restrictions on you couldn't. They basically made it impossible for the consumer to have any fun. Right, it was like the NFL, and so those things already, and that's what they thought was the right strategy. We weren't going to let Steve Jobs snooker us or anybody else. And then about the time I left, he and Eddie Q and Cena figured out that if they made it Mac only, it might be a palatable experiment for people. You know, the thing that helped them a lot was that their things had already flamed out. So in between '01 and '03, their things were such colossal failures, right, that got them more open-minded about doing something else, right? And of course, Steve is, you know, once Steve gets involved, you know, by this time Pixar was really successful, and, you know, people want to hang out with Steve. Even if he can be rude, people just are, he was a very sexy and charismatic guy to be with. And so all else being equal, you'll do the thing Steve tells you to do just because he's so charismatic, right? Never fails.
Well, and at that point, it's almost helpful that he can be thought of as a Hollywood mogul like them. Like, he's coming as an equal.
By 2003, he was.
Right,
Look
exactly.
at the Pixar track record by then. That's right. He knew more than they did. That's right. You know, Pixar was making more money than they were. So, yeah, that all helped. And, you know, and he is legitimately was that smart. So, but there was not a new idea. It was always the idea, right, to sell songs. It was just hard to get the deal done, right? And he did it brilliantly.
Well, I mean, however, specifically to sell songs individually, was there a lot of pushback on that? Because they're trying to protect the...
Well, but that's a classic example of Steve using the fact that their thing had failed to leverage his own insane demand for simplicity, you know, like 99 cents. He didn't want $1. He wanted 99 cents. And his whole thing was he thought correctly that albums were a ripoff. You know, every stoner who bought an album knows that of the 12 songs on it, 3 or 4 are filler, or sometimes 9 or 10 are filler, right? So he knew that, right? And he thought it would be simpler to just have 99 cents a song, and that way you wouldn't have to spend very much money, and you could be approachable and everything. So yeah, mostly he was just a guy who loved simplicity more than anything else. And any sort of like, oh, well, for this it's that, and this it's that, and on Tuesdays it's that, he just hated that stuff, right? He hated it. You know, it was the same reason why he wanted to open his own stores, is that he hated the experience of going into somebody else's store and seeing them messing up his beautiful marketing, right? And giving them margin to do it. Like, why should I give these guys 12 points and just add no value, to subtract value, you know? So same thing, the love of simplicity.
Well, final question then. So you leave around 2004, and
yeah, I left when he got sick. So what happened was he came into my office, shut the door, and he said, "Can I talk to you?" And I go, "Sure." And he goes, "I have pancreatic cancer. I'm going to die." And I'm like, "What?" And he started crying, and then, you know, it was a really heavy-duty moment. And then that was on a Monday, and then on Tuesday he comes back in my office and he goes, "I don't have pancreatic cancer." And I'm like, "What the fuck?" And he goes, "I have this other kind of tumor called an islet cell tumor, which is rare but treatable, blah, 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 blah." So he then stopped going to work. It was a secret. So from late '03 to mid '04, he went to work about a day a week, and no one knew. It was a big secret. And he did everything but surgery. He did acupuncture and all this other stuff, and it didn't work. And then he finally agreed to have surgery in the summer of '04. And so once he started stopped going there all the time, I stopped going there because my job was to be with him, kind of, right? And then when he got well, we were both kind of like, well, you know, the company doesn't need a change agent as much anymore, you know, so we kind of mutually agreed to stop it. I did it for about 6 years.
All week, I've been using Grammarly to write this show, as I've told you, and all week, I've been telling you should be using Grammarly in your work, no matter what that work is. Because Grammarly Premium's advanced tone suggestions can help you communicate confidently and reframe your words to be more positive and productive, so you and your team can get on the same page and projects get done on time. Grammarly works where you do already. Grammarly Premium's tone suggestions take your writings in emails or decks or documents to the next level, keeping you professional as you balance being direct and friendly while finding solutions with your team. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features, advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. The right tone can move any project forward when you get it just right with Grammarly. Go to Grammarly.com/Techmeme to download and learn more about Grammarly Premium's advanced tone suggestions. That's GRAMMARLY.com/Techmeme. Ranked as the number 3 best university in the country for solving climate change, Oregon State University makes seeking solutions a priority, going the farthest lengths to help the earth and all living things thrive. Their creative minds, research knowledge, and drive inspire them to generate ideas no one else has. Oregon State will never stop doing the hard work. They will continue exploring, creating, and taking action on the issues that matter most to their students and community, and build a better world for future generations. Oregon State is a dynamic community of dreamers, doers, problem solvers, and change makers, the type of folks who don't wait for challenges to present themselves, but instead seek them out and take them on. Oregon State welcomes students, faculty, and staff from every background and perspective into a community where everyone feels seen and heard. They have deep-rooted mindfulness for the natural world and all who depend on it, and together they apply knowledge, tools, and skills to build a better future for all. Discover more at oregonstate.edu. That's oregonstate.edu.
Well, but that was going to be my final question. So it's this era, 2004, 2005, where I think it's around then they dropped computer from their name. So sort of my question is, as you're observing this, a company that had only done computers for 20, 25 years, and then now is in the media business selling songs, is now in the consumer electronics business, or what just from your perspective, the evolution of Apple into something that's more than just we make computers, was that because of the
iPod.
Right.
And the iPod completely.
And was it an organic change? Was it like sort of, okay, wow, if we can do this, maybe we can do these other things. Maybe we should do camcorders.
Yeah, so the funny thing is that not really by design, the iPod and the retail stores launched like the same month, right? Just by coincidence.
Right.
So, and the iPod slowly but surely becomes a monster hit. Like I remember after a couple of quarters doing a couple of spreadsheets for Steve about some other project we were working on, and I said to him, look, if this and this happened, the iPod could be $1 billion business. And at the time, Apple was about a $7 billion, $8 billion revenue run rate company, and they were kind of flat, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like, and he was like, come on. I'm like, well, look, and it was only like a couple of X bump from where they were already, right? So you could see even after a couple of quarters that it could be $1 billion business. And once something's $1 billion business, it could be anything, right? Mm-hmm. And so, the iPod, and as you point out, after a few months they sold it on Windows, and even though a mere mortal might not have been able to figure it out, lots of people did, right? And so you could go into the Apple store and buy something that didn't require Mac OS X, right? Which is a big deal because most people had Windows. 95% of the world had Windows. So that was a really big deal. And then you see them kind of get more aggressive. I remember being in the meeting where Steve showed us the video of 50 Cent singing that he was a motherfucking PIMP while he was holding an iPod. And Steve's like telling how much we paid for it, and he's kind of shaking his head like, oh, Jesus. So, it was already happening, right? In 2002, 2003, as the iPod became more and more successful and equally important, sold to people who had never bought anything from Apple before. That's the thing people kind of forget, is that even though its creation never would have happened without it being Mac only, pretty quickly it grew and gave people a different way to feel about it. It was the first time they ever beat Microsoft at anything, right? Since 1985. So it had this double benefit of making you confident about their ability to grow as a company, right?
Right, and
in lots of different ways.
Like it had such a psychological impact that they realized that we're not just a Mac business, we're an anything we want to do business if we can do it right.
Well, and the thing a lot of people forget is that way before the iPhone, remember a bunch of people started competing with the iPod. So SanDisk and all these people were making, little hard disk based players. Because remember, after the iPod gets to 5 and 10 and 20, you get the Mini. Remember the Mini?
Right, of course.
The Mini was a hard disk-based player with a 2 and 4 gig drive, not a flash-based drive. And then everybody started doing
also.
Yeah, and everybody started doing those because they had lower cogs, and even though the libraries weren't as big, it was an approachable price point. So then Apple blows everybody away with the Nano. And so this is all Tim Cook. This is Tim Cook figuring out that if you use your market power, you can take flash, which at the time was like buying gold. It was so expensive, right? And you can drive the price down. And they cornered the market on flash that year. They did this crazy forward buy on flash. And so mostly through supply chain work, not through anything else, they totally changed the market. And overnight, flash went from an exotic thing that only geeky rich people bought for in small quantities to like a mainstream thing. Remember the Nano? What a big deal the Nano was. It was so small, and that's all Tim Cook. That's all supply chain wizardry.
Well, and not only
Steve was sick then.
Not only does that keep the price down, but then it prevents others from coming into the space. You don't
because they locked up the supply of flash for like over a year. That's right. That's what I mean. Is that in addition to driving the price down, they did two things. It was this gutsy move because what if it hadn't sold well, right? And in addition to that, it blew away the competition. So in one fell swoop, they started acting like Microsoft used to act, right, as a company with market power.
Well, and
that was a huge deal.
Actually, the third thing is when you think about it, though, it's also that because the Mini was the best seller of the iPods of that era, so that's that first move of we're going to eat our young, we're going to innovate ourselves.
And the other thing that's funny is that Steve tried to cancel the Mini twice. So the Mini, Steve thought 2 and 4 was too small, right, of a music library. The people had 5, 10s, and 20s,
right,
and so he tried to cancel it twice before it shipped, and Rubinstein basically ignored him. He just ignored his pleas to cancel it, and I remember I said to him, I was like being kind of cynical. I was like, "It's so good looking. Who cares? Don't ever. It's just pretty. People will buy it because it's cute."
And that became true.
Oh no, I was right. It just seems sort of like at the time it seemed like a really cynical thing to say, right? But it was true, right? So cute, right? But anyway, and then the Nano just blew it away, right? I was looking at the Nano. The Nano was September 7th, 2005, and that was the first flash-based. Let's see. He pulled it out of his watch pocket.
The small pocket in the jeans, right. He says something like, I always wondered what this pocket was for.
Right. And it was, let's see, the first one, 1, 2, and 4. Yeah, right. Unbelievable. So anyway, that's a really big deal to me. That's probably, even though they were working on the iPhone, sort of the moment I always thought when Apple arrived as this company that wasn't just doing well, but was like dominating a category, right? They left all those other guys flat-footed, right?
Well, Mike, that once again, I'm so glad that you agreed to come back and do this because those are
sure.
all the juicy stories that I was hoping for.
Yeah, there's probably more, but
yeah.
Right. But that's kind of what I was living. Right?
Yeah. Well, Mike Slade, thanks for coming back on the Internet History Podcast, and just amazing stuff. Thanks.
You bet. My pleasure. All right. Talk to you later.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod. And my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.